Here's an overview of how the rest of today is going to work. Today is going to be interactive, and we're going to be moving pretty fast to make sure it's a nice, fun program for everybody. We're going to be providing both information from our speakers, our research partners, and a panel, along with some opportunities at the end to interact with fellow attendees from across the state. So what we're going to start off with today is a keynote with an interview with Kimberly Zarecor. We're going to get a sneak peek. We're delighted to welcome Wade Britt and Max Hoxie from Bâton Global, who are going to give us a preliminary look at some of the people and culture related results from our Envision Iowa Statewide Leaders Sentiment Survey. After hearing from Wade and Max, we're going to have a panel discussion with a great group from across the state, where we're going to talk about population growth. And then after that, we're going to head into a breakout session so you can meet people from across the state. I know sometimes not everybody's always excited to get and meet new people, so we'd encourage you to stay. We promise. We've done this in the past. 85% of the respondents said they made some great new connections in those breakouts, a great way to meet some people that otherwise you wouldn't have an opportunity to meet physically, just because we have the opportunity to be across the statewide reach here with today's event. Ultimately, what can you expect to get out of these think tanks? We hope that you get the opportunity to listen and hear to experts, hear some research, get to connect and share some ideas around some key themes. As a media company, we feel it's our role to help be the convener, to help make sure we're fostering these discussions and infusing them within our products so other people can engage with them as well. We've got a great group from across the state. And so if you would, in your name in the chat, if you've got an opportunity, we'd love to go ahead and you can use that chat function right now. We want to make sure that you've got that ability to do so. Go ahead and put in your name, where you're from, what you're excited for with this program as well. All right, let's go ahead and dive into our program. I'm really delighted to introduce Kimberly. She's the leader of the Rural Shrink Smart Project and professor of architecture in the College of Design at Iowa State University. The Rural Shrink Smart Projects is a NSF-funded project that explores small and shrinking rural communities in Iowa that have been able to protect quality of life and community services for the residents, even as they've lost population. Their goal is to develop tools to help small and shrinking communities actively plan for a shrinking population and how that affects their quality of life. Their work questions the whole framework of population growth and instead emphasizes the need for a mindset shift for communities to focus on quality of life and not just the quantity of people. That can be a bit provocative. The title of our event today, of course, is How Do We Help Iowa's Population Grow? And intentionally today, I wanted to bring her into the conversation to start us off, to give us just a little bit of a twist and a little bit of a counter way to think about population and as we think about people and culture and growing our communities. So Kim, why don't you go ahead and start us off and tell us a little bit about your research and about the program.
So hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm especially happy that Shive Hattery is sponsoring Go Architecture firms into this conversation. So I have been at Iowa State for 19 years. I am trained as an architectural historian. I teach also architectural design and research methods. And about 7 years ago, I got interested in the topic of shrinking rural communities in Iowa, which is something that all of us who live here see. Anytime you leave a place like Ames or West Des Moines or Waukee or Ankeny and you drive out a few minutes, you realize that the state looks very different away from the booming metros. And as a research question, I wasn't seeing a lot of people asking research questions about this. Like the group today, there's a lot of conversations about economic development and the desire that we have as a state to grow, and that there's so much energy in the business community for growth. But I think the important part of our project is that we are researchers. We're entering the question to try to better understand what we see around us. And we don't come with a predetermined position on the questions that we ask. And I find that a lot of people who are involved with research about rural communities come in with a perspective that the job of the research is to give people ideas for how to fix the problem of shrinking populations. And our research project is explicitly something else, which says there's no fix. Rural communities and most communities in Iowa will continue to lose population. And we take that as the starting point and a given, and we say that it's okay. We try to take a little bit of the shame out of that statement for communities and say that the goal is actually to really focus on keeping people happy, understanding what they love about their communities, using storytelling to really highlight all of the great ways that Iowa provides a quality of life that's not available in many other places anymore, and that's really the focus. And the number of people in a community is something that you're not really going to be able to control in most of Iowa. And this, as Chris mentioned, can be provocative for some people. And I think this audience is a great one to share some of our thoughts about this and what the research and the data tells us.
So I wonder, can you maybe provide a couple examples of the way your research has been tried to be applied in different communities?
Yeah, sure. So I'll talk at a high level first. The question is, what do people think of when they think of quality of life? So the research tells us that people think about a lot of different qualities in their community: schools, local government, jobs, housing, medical services. There's actually 7 dimensions that the research says come together for people's perception of their quality of life. What we're trying to think about in communities is, how can a community that's losing population, which, as I said, is the majority of communities in Iowa, how can they still see some positive effects from actions that they take, intentional decisions that a community can make that really focus on the dimensions of quality of life that matter to people? So how can you use the resources in your community to protect the quality of the schools and the infrastructure? And how can you have great community events? Because our research tells us that that's what's really going to help people think that they want to stay and really want to invest in a rural community or a shrinking community. I think some of the examples that we've seen in our communities that we've been working with are a lot of activities and events that they've sponsored that address a range of different population groups in a community. So not just stuff for young families, not just stuff from people who are retired, but actually trying to think about the community as a whole, as all of the people in the community, and thinking about ways to bring them to festivals, to do activities together, to create community spaces. And we see in communities that this has a big effect on people's perceptions of feeling that they belong in a community, that they're valued, that if they were to leave, people would miss them. It sounds like a really simple thing, but this is something that matters a lot to people. And the communities that we've seen who are successful at this, they have not seen population increase. I think this is a really important message of the project: is you can do everything right. You can take all the advice from consultants, from research, you can put these activities in place, you can do the investment. The population trend itself is not going to change in most places. It is a macroeconomic change. It's not in the control of individual communities. And we have to separate the two questions, quality of life from the population trend.
So talk a little bit about that. I imagine you've had some pushback to the idea of saying that it's a foregone conclusion that some of these communities aren't going to have the opportunity for population growth. How have you tried to address that? What's that been like as you've gone through that process?
I think one of the first things is just to encourage people to allow that message to sink in and to just think about it a little bit. If we take away the idea that there's some fault in this population loss, that a community has done something wrong, or they've made bad choices, or that they missed an opportunity and that's why the population is going down, our project says it's truly outside of your control. This is about the history of the state and agriculture in the 19th century, how the towns were settled in Iowa. There's simply not a mechanism to repopulate the almost 1,000 towns that we have in this state. And about 75% of them have fewer than 750 people. So if you can imagine, we're a state full of very small places. And so to imagine that there's a way that all of those places can consistently find new people, not just move people from place to place. This is something we talk to towns about. And once they kind of process this, that this really is the deep, persistent, long-term, not going to change pattern, I think it's a lot easier to just open the next part of the conversation, which is, what kind of community do you want to live in? How do you want to participate in making it a community where people feel welcome, valued, and that they belong? And what are actions you can take, no matter what the population is, to help other people in the community feel positive feelings about living there?
You talked about some of those actions that they can take to make the community valuable and rich and vibrant. So talk a little bit about, you talked about events. Are there some other ways
Mhm.
that communities have really tried to focus?
Yeah, so I think a lot of you are probably familiar with the idea of weak ties. But if you're not, what we've found is that in rural communities and in small communities, weak ties are the thing that really help people belong. And a weak tie is someone who's outside of your friend or family group, but somebody you might see at the coffee shop, somebody who works in the grocery store, the guy who delivers your mail. The patterns of seeing people over and over again, smiling at them, saying hello, somebody at a restaurant knowing your favorite order. These are weak ties that we see are really important to people's perception of living in a small and shrinking town. And the towns that we work with, we see all kinds of evidence that people develop these kinds of relationships and that they matter a lot. And so I would just say that, when you're thinking in a community, we ask people in our workshops, what have you personally done in the last few days to make someone that you know in your community have that positive feeling? Have you smiled at somebody? Have you learned someone's name who maybe you didn't ask them before? Did you open the door for someone and say hi to them? We want to kind of cultivate this idea that it's an intentional act to participate in bringing this sense of belonging to the community. And we really try to emphasize that there's an emotional piece of this. People feel that they belong. There's not a kind of recipe, there's not instructions. It's really this bringing this positive attitude and mindset about the place.
Well, it's interesting because that's something that I think we talk about a lot in Iowa in general, and in larger cities too. Des Moines, people have struggled to put a data point behind that, but I absolutely know what you mean in terms of those weak ties. My father-in-law, he moved from Florida. He went to the doctor the first time, and he asked how you're doing, and he started talking about his health, and the doctor said, no, I was just asking what your day, how's your day going, right? And he was so used to
Exactly.
having that exchange. And so that idea of the weak ties is a really interesting one, and probably one that can be extrapolated to other communities as well. You
Yeah.
talked about the process of doing kind of the community workshop. What does that look like? And maybe if you have an example of a community you've worked with, that could be really helpful too.
So one of the communities that we love to talk about is Elma out in Howard County, out in Northeast Iowa, because this is the smallest of our towns that we've been working with. And when I say working with, what we've done is we've gone, visited, listened, learned, and then come back to Ames, to our kind of research context, and tried to take what we learned and turn it into knowledge that we can share out. So we go to communities that already know how to do this well, and we know this from what we see in the quality of life data that we have about them. And that's another part of the project. There's something called the Iowa Small Town Poll. So we only have learned from towns where we also have Iowa Small Town Poll data. So I think one of the things that we see is that there's individuals in the community who have taken it upon themselves, literally 1, 2, 3 people who have decided to lead others into this kind of community work. So it's not just a question of whether there's a good mindset about this in the community, but you have to have these individuals who step up and take the time. And so in Elma, they have a really wonderful small group of people who for maybe 10 years have really actively been trying to work on specific topics, fundraising, building community spaces. They brought a health clinic. They built relationships out to the Mennonite community that surrounds Elma, which has helped them to think about how to grow some businesses in town that could also attract people from outside in these Mennonite areas. And that's allowed them to have a more creative approach to what a 500-person town can do. And I think that one of the observations we have from all of our communities is that if you have these individuals who put a lot of time in, and often there's individuals who also put private financial resources in, so they support with philanthropy. Even in a little town, there's a lot of philanthropy happening to pay for a lot of the activities. There is a vulnerability in all of these communities. If you are a shrinking town, you really can be vulnerable if 1 or 2 people who have been leading the effort, they either pass away, they move, their family situation changes, their job changes, and they no longer have the time or the resources to put into the community. One of the activities or the actions that we see in communities is to actually mentor another generation of leaders all the way down into the younger people in town, so that if those people who've been doing the work need to step away or they are no longer there, you do have some people ready to go. Sometimes in communities, we have observed that there's a clique, a small group at the top, and they don't want to let new people into that kind of group of people that are leading. Better communities in terms of perceptions of quality of life have a more open structure. People who want to join are welcomed. They're given work to do. Their talents are showcased, and you see a much more kind of fluid set of people coming in and out for different activities. One of the great people that we met in one of our communities in a town called Bancroft up in Kossuth County in northern Iowa gave us this advice that I had never thought about, which is when she's recruiting volunteers for events, she only asks people to give an hour. So if a festival is happening all day, or you need to staff a booth to sell something for a few hours, you don't ask one person to stay for the whole time. You say, come for an hour, and that's it. I just need you for the hour. And that's a low threshold to enter into a volunteering role. And at the same time, you've also brought that person to your event, and they can enjoy the event for the times that they're not volunteering. And just thinking a little bit about that, the nuance of that. Is really a kind of like, it's a genius that some people have. You know, we just discovered all these amazing people making small choices that have big effects in these towns.
There's a couple questions in the chat related to the idea of some areas that maybe have had some growth from a population standpoint. I'm curious. One was referencing maybe some success that Minnesota has had with growing their rural towns and comparing that, and then also I believe it was Sioux.
I saw that Sioux County.
Yeah, Sioux County as well. So just curious if you have any knowledge around that area, and then I'll have one last question for you after this.
Okay, great. I'm gonna answer all of this together because what we want to really stress is that we work with aggregate data. We are not saying there's not an exceptional example in which a community is able to grow. What we are saying is that overall, rural communities in Iowa and small towns in the upper Midwest are not going to grow if we look at a long-term population trend line. It's a fact. So individual exceptions are actually just about storytelling, and there may be a particular thing happening. Sometimes those communities are actually closer to a metro than what we look at. We look at rural communities that are at least 50 miles from a metro. So we're not looking at bedroom communities, and we're not looking at rural places that are near to a city. We're really trying to understand the true rural parts of a state. So the Minnesota question, I would counter a few ways. First of all, the politics of our states are very different. And there are going to be diversity of view among the people who are on the call today about the positives and the negatives of the two different positions of the state governments of a Republican administration or a Democratic one. But I would say that Minnesota's liberal policies, the data would say, attract more younger, more educated and more professional people into the metro areas of Minnesota. And that has the effect of bringing just a lot more people into the state, and they start to push out into those ex-urban areas. And there's a capacity to leave Minneapolis and go to a smaller community and staying in a state that you still feel maybe represents values that you have at a larger level that are more typical for people who live in an urban area. In Iowa, we have seen what we would call in our research, we've seen some choices made at the state level that have kept resources out of the hands of the leadership of small communities. So there has been choices made that centralize some of the resources of the state in the state capital and don't give small towns autonomy to make as many financial decisions about how they want to spend their money as they would like. And we hear this from every community we work with, that they feel more and more constrained and starved of financial resources through taxation and other policies. And this, in the long term, will have effect. Whether people agree with it or not, I do think that there is a difference in Minnesota on that topic in terms of how resources are shared.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. It's a
Mm,
complex topic. It's one that I thought
mhm,
your perspective of thinking through the lens of how, as communities are shifting, that there's multiple ways to think about thriving. It doesn't always have to be around growth specifically,
mhm,
even though there might be communities that are having some success with growth. And I'm sure people want to explore that. We're going to continue to explore that from both angles. And so, Kimberly, thank you so much for being here today and
My pleasure.
participating.
And I'm
And
going to stick around and
good.
hang
I'm glad
out
you're going
in
to
the
stick around too.
breakouts. So I'll see some people there.
Perfect. Thank you so much.